Section 13. The Borgias, Chapter 6, Part 2. When, however, M. de Guise and M. de Tronwy found themselves pressed in this way, they ordered their 200 men-at-arms to turn right about face, while at the opposite end, that is, at the head of the army, Maréchal de Guise and Trevulles ordered a halt and lances in rest. Meanwhile, according to custom, the king, who, as we said, was in the centre, was conferring knighthood on those gentlemen who had earned the favour either by virtue of their personal powers or the king's special friendship. Suddenly there was heard a terrible clash behind. It was the French rearguard coming to blows with the Marquis of Mantua. Where each man had singled out his own foe as though it were a tournament, very many lances were broken, especially those of the Italian knights, for their lances were hollowed so as to be less heavy, and in consequence had less solidity. Those who were thus disarmed at once seized their swords. As they were far more numerous than the French, the king saw them suddenly outflanking his right wing, and apparently prepared to surround it. At the same moment loud cries were heard from a direction facing the centre. This meant that the Stradiotes were crossing the river to make their attack. The king at once ordered his division into 2 detachments, and giving one to Bourbon the Bastard, to make head against the Stradiotes, he hurried with the second to the rescue of the van, flinging himself into the very midst of the melee, striking out with the king, and doing as steady work as the lowest in rank of his captains. Aided by the reinforcement, the rearguard made a good stand, though the enemy were 5 against 1, and the combat in this part continued to rage with wonderful fury. Obeying his orders, Bourbon had thrown himself upon the Stradiotes, but unfortunately, carried off by his horse, he had penetrated so far into the enemy's ranks that he was lost to sight. The disappearance of their chief, the strange dress of their new antagonists, and the peculiar method of their fighting produced a considerable effect on those who were to attack them, and for the moment disorder was the consequence in the centre, and the horsemen scattered instead of serrying their ranks and fighting in a body. This false move would have done them serious harm, had not most of the Stradiotes, seeing the baggage alone and undefended, rushed after that in hope of booty, instead of following up their advantage. A great part of the troop nevertheless stayed behind to fight, pressing on the French cavalry and smashing their lances with fearful scimitars. Happily the king, who had just repulsed the Marquis of Mantua's attack, perceived what was going on behind him, and riding back at all possible speed to the succour of the centre, together with the gentlemen of his household, fell upon the Stradiotes, no longer armed with a lance, for that he had just broken, but brandishing his long sword, which blazed about him like lightning, and, either because he was whirled away like Bourbon by his own horse, or because he had allowed his courage to take him too far, he suddenly found himself in the thickest ranks of the Stradiotes, accompanied only by 8 of the knights he had just now created, one equerry with Antoine de Rambourg and his standard-bearer. "France! France!" he cried aloud, to rally round him all the others who had scattered. They, seeing at last the danger was less than they had supposed, began to take their revenge and to pay back with interest the blows they had received from the Stradiotes. Things were going still better, for the van which the Marquis de Cajazzo was to attack. For although he had at first appeared to be animated with a terrible purpose, he stopped short about 10 or 12 feet from the French line and turned right about face without breaking a single lance. The French wanted to pursue, but the Maréchal de Guise, fearing that this fight might be only a trick to draw off the vanguard from the centre, ordered every man to stay in his place. But the Swiss, who were German and did not understand the order, or thought it was not meant for them, followed upon their heels, and although on foot, caught them up and killed 100 of them. This was quite enough to throw them into disorder, so that some were scattered about the plain, and others made a rush for the water, so as to cross the river and rejoin their camp. When the Maréchal de Guise saw this, he detached 100 of his own men to go to the aid of the king, who was continuing to fight with unheard of courage, and running the greatest risks, constantly separated as he was from his gentlemen, who could not follow him, for wherever there was danger, thither he rushed with his cry of "France," little troubling himself as to whether he was followed or not. And it was no longer with his sword that he fought, that he had long ago broken, like his lance, but with a heavy battle-axe, whose every blow was mortal whether cut or pierced. Thus the Stradiotes, already hard pressed by the king's household and his pensioners, soon changed attack for defence, and defence for flight. It was at this moment that the king was really in the greatest danger, for he had let himself be carried away in pursuit of the fugitives, and presently found himself all alone, surrounded by these men, who, had they not been struck with a mighty terror, would have had nothing to do but unite and crush him and his horse together. But, as Commune remarks, he whom God guards is well guarded, and God was guarding the King of France. All the same, at this moment the French were sorely pressed in the rear, and although de Guise and de la Tremblay held out as firmly as it was possible to hold, they would probably have been compelled to yield to superior numbers had not a double aid arrived in time. First the indefatigable Charles, who, having nothing more to do amongst the fugitives, once again dashed into the midst of the fight. Next the servants of the army, who, now that they were set free from the Spadiotes and saw their enemies put to flight, ran up armed with the axes they habitually used to cut down wood for building their huts. They burst into the middle of the fray, slashing at the horses' legs and dealing heavy blows that smashed in the visors of the dismounted horsemen. The Italians could not hold out against this double attack. The Furia Francese rendered all their strategy and all their calculations useless, especially as for more than a century they had abandoned their fights of blood and fury for a kind of tournament they chose to regard as warfare. So, in spite of all Gonzaga's efforts, they turned their backs upon the French rear and took to flight. In the greatest haste and with much difficulty they recrossed the torrent, which was swollen even more now by the rain that had been falling during the whole time of the battle. Some thought fit to pursue the vanquished, for there was now such disorder in their ranks that they were fleeing in all directions from the battlefield where the French had gained so glorious a victory, looking up the roads to Parma and Berchetta. But Marshal de Guise and de Tremblay, who had done quite enough to save them from the suspicion of quailing before imaginary dangers, put a stop to this enthusiasm by pointing out that it would only be risking the loss of their present advantage if they tried to push it farther with men and horses so worn out. This view was adopted in spite of the opinion of Cabosse, Camillo Vitelli, and Francesco Secco, who were all eager to follow up the victory. The king retired to a little village on the left bank of the Taro, and took shelter in a poor house. There he disarmed, being perhaps among all the captains and all the soldiers the man who had fought best. During the night the torrent swelled so high the Italian army could not have pursued, even if they had laid aside their fears. The king did not propose to give the appearance of fight after a victory, and therefore kept his army drawn up all day, and at night went on to sleep at Medesano, a little village only a mile lower down than the hamlet where he rested after the fight. But in the course of the night he reflected that he had done enough for the honour of his arms in fighting an army 4 times as great as his own, and killing 3,000 men, and then waiting a day and a half to give them time to take their revenge. So 2 hours before daybreak he had the fires lighted, that the enemy might suppose he would remain in the camp, and every man mounting noiselessly, the whole French army, almost out of danger by this time, proceeded on their march to Borgo San Donnino. While this was going on, the Pope returned to Rome, where news highly favourable to his schemes was not slow to reach his ears. He learned that Ferdinand had crossed from Sicily into Calabria with 6,000 volunteers and a considerable number of Spanish horse and foot, led, at the command of Ferdinand and Isabella, by the famous Gonzaga de Cordova, who arrived in Italy with a great reputation, destined to suffer somewhat from the defeat at Seminara. At almost the same time the French fleet had been beaten by the Aragonese. Moreover, the Battle of the Taro, though a complete defeat for the Confederates, was another victory for the Pope, because its result was to open a return to France for that man whom he regarded as his deadliest foe. So, feeling that he had nothing more to fear from Charles, he sent him a brief at Turin, where he had stopped for a short time to give aid to Navarre, therein commanding him, by virtue of his pontifical authority, to depart out of Italy with his army, and to recall within 10 days those of his troops that still remained in the kingdom of Naples, on pain of excommunication, and a summons to appear before him in person. Charles VIII replied, 1. That he did not understand how the Pope, the chief of the League, ordered him to leave Italy, whereas the Confederates had not only refused him a passage, but had even attempted, though unsuccessfully, as perhaps his Holiness knew, to cut off his return into France. 2. That as to recalling his troops from Naples, he was not so irreligious as to do that, since they had not entered the kingdom without the consent and blessing of his Holiness. 3. That he was exceedingly surprised that the Pope should require his presence in person at the capital of the Christian world just at the present time, when 6 weeks previously, at the time of his return from Naples, although he ardently desired an interview with His Holiness, that he might offer proofs of his respect and obedience, His Holiness, instead of according this favour, had quitted Rome so hastily on his approach that he had not been able to come up with him by any effort whatsoever. On this point, however, he promised to give His Holiness the satisfaction he desired, if he would engage this time to wait for him. He would therefore return to Rome as soon as the affairs that brought him back to his own kingdom had been satisfactorily settled. Although in this reply there was a touch of mockery and defiance, Charles was none the less compelled by the circumstances of the case to obey the Pope's strange plea. His presence was so much needed in France that, in spite of the arrival of the Swiss reinforcement, he was compelled to conclude a peace with Ludovico Sforza, whereby he yielded Novara to him, while Gilbert de Montpensier and d'Aubigny, after defending, inch by inch, Calabria, Bracciolite, and Naples, were obliged to sign the capitulation of Pella after a siege of 32 days, on the 20th of July, 1496. This involved giving back to Ferdinand II, King of Naples, all the palaces and fortresses of his kingdom, which indeed he did thus enjoy for 3 months, dying of exhaustion on the 7th of September following, at the Castello della Somma, at the foot of Vesuvius. All the attentions lavished upon him by his young wife could not repair the evil that her beauty had wrought. His uncle Frederick succeeded, and so, in the 3 years of his papacy, Alexander VI had seen 5 kings upon the throne of Naples, while he was establishing himself more firmly upon his own pontifical seat. Ferdinand I, Alfonso I, Charles VIII, Ferdinand II, and Frederick. All this agitation about his throne, the rapid succession of sovereigns, was the best thing possible for Alexander, for each new monarch became actually king only on condition of his receiving the pontifical investiture. The consequence was that Alexander was the only gainer in power and credit by these changes, for the Duke of Milan and the republics of Florence and Venice had successively recognized him as supreme head of the Church, in spite of his simony. Moreover, the 5 kings of Naples had in turn paid him homage. So he thought the time had now come for founding a mighty family, and for this he relied upon the Duke of Gandia, who was to hold all the highest temporal dignities, and upon Caesar Borgia, who was to be appointed to all the great ecclesiastical offices. The Pope made sure of the success of these new projects by electing 4 Spanish cardinals, who brought up the number of his compatriots in the Sacred College to 22, thus assuring him a constant and certain majority. The first requirement of the Pope's policy was to clear away from the neighbourhood of Rome all those petty lords whom most people call vicars of the Church, but whom Alexander called the shackles of the papacy. We saw that he had already begun this work by rousing the Orsini against the Colonna family, when Charles VIII enterprise compelled him to concentrate all his mental resources, and also all the forces of his state, so as to secure his own personal safety. It had come about through their own imprudent action that the Orsini, the Pope's old friends, were now in the pay of the French, and had entered the kingdom of Naples with them, where one of them, Virginio, a very important member of their powerful house, had been taken prisoner during the war, and was Ferdinand II's captive. Alexander could not let this opportunity escape him, so, first ordering the King of Naples not to release a man who, ever since the 1st of June 1496, had been a declared rebel, he pronounced a sentence of confiscation against Virginio Orsini and his whole family in a secret consistory, which sat on the 26th of October following, that is to say, in the early days of the reign of Frederick, whom he knew to be entirely at his command, owing to the king's great desire of getting the investiture from them. Then, as it was not enough to declare the goods confiscated without also dispossessing the owners, he made overtures to the Colonna family, saying he would commission them, in proof of their new bond of friendship, to execute the order given against their old enemies under the direction of his son Francesco, Duke of Gandia. In this fashion he contrived to weaken his neighbours each by means of the other, till such time as he could safely attack and put an end to conquered and conqueror alike. The Colonna family accepted this proposition, and the Duke of Gandia was named General of the Church. His father, in his pontifical robes, bestowed on him the insignia of this office in the Church of St. Peter's at Rome. End of section number 13.
Section 14. The Borgias, Chapter 7, Part 1. Matters went forward as Alexander had wished, and before the end of the year the pontifical army had seized a great number of castles and fortresses that belonged to the Orsini, who thought themselves already lost when Charles VIII came to the rescue. They had addressed themselves to him without much hope that he could be of real use to them, with his want of armed troops and his preoccupation with his own affairs. He, however, sent Carlo Orsini, son of Virginio the prisoner, and Vitellozzo Vitelli, brother of Camillo Vitelli, one of the 3 valiant Italian condottieri who had joined him and fought for him at the crossing of the Taro. These 2 captains, whose courage and skill were well known, brought with them a considerable sum of money from the liberal coffers of Charles VIII. Now scarcely had they arrived at Città di Castello, the center of their little sovereignty, and expressed their intention of raising a band of soldiers, when men presented themselves from all sides to fight under their banner. So they very soon assembled a small army, and as they had been able during their stay among the French to study those matters of military organization in which France excelled, they now applied the result of their learning to their own troops. The improvements were mainly certain changes in the artillery which made their maneuvers easier, and the substitution for their ordinary weapons of pikes similar in form to the Swiss pikes, but 2 feet longer. These changes effected, Vitellozzo Vitelli spent 3 or 4 months in exercising his men in the management of their new weapons. Then, when he thought them fit to make good use of these, and when he had collected more or less help from the towns of Perugia, Todi, and Narni, where the inhabitants trembled lest their turn should come after the Orsinis, as the Orsinis had followed on the Colonnas, he marched towards Bracciano, which was being besieged by the Duke of Urbino, who had been lent to the Pope by the Venetians in virtue of the treaty quoted above. The Venetian general, when he heard of Vitelli's approach, thought he might as well spare him half his journey, and marched out to confront him. The 2 armies met in the Soriano road, and the battle straightway began. The pontifical army had a body of 800 Germans, on which the Dukes of Urbino and Gandia chiefly relied, as well they might, for they were the best troops in the world. But Vitelli attacked these picked men with his infantry, who, armed with their formidable pikes, ran them through, while they, with arms 4 feet shorter, had no chance even of returning the blows they received. At the same time, Vitelli's light troops wheeled upon the flank, following their most rapid movements, and silencing the enemy's artillery by the swiftness and accuracy of their attack. The pontifical troops were put to flight, though after a longer resistance than might have been expected when they had to sustain the attack of an army so much better equipped than their own. With them they bore to Ronciglione, the Duke of Gandia, wounded in the face by a pike thrust, Fabrizia Colonna, and the envoy. The Duke of Urbino, who was fighting in the rear to aid the retreat, was taken prisoner with all his artillery and the baggage of the conquered army. But this success, great as it was, did not so swell the pride of Vitellozzo Vitelli as to make him oblivious of his position. He knew that he and the Orsini together were too weak to sustain a war of such magnitude, that the little store of money to which he owed the existence of his army would very soon be expended, and his army would disappear with it. So he hastened to get pardoned for the victory by making propositions which he would very likely have refused had he been the vanquished party, and the Pope accepted his conditions without demur. During the interval, having heard that Trivulce had just recrossed the Alps and re-entered Italy with 3,000 Swiss, and fearing lest the Italian general might only be the advance guard of the King of France. So it was settled that the Orsini should pay 70,000 florins for the expenses of the war, and that all the prisoners on both sides should be exchanged without ransom, with the single exception of the Duke of Urbino. As a pledge for the future payment of the 70,000 florins, the Orsini handed over to the Cardinals Sforza and San Severino the fortresses of Anguillara and Cervetri. Then, when the day came and they had not the necessary money, they gave up their prisoner, the Duke of Urbino, estimating his worth at 40,000 ducats, nearly all the sum required, and handed him over to Alexander on account. He, a rigid observer of engagements, made his own general, taken prisoner in his service, pay to himself the ransom he owed to the enemy. Then the Pope had the corpse of Virginio sent to Carlo Orsini and Vitellozzo Vitelli, as he could not send him alive. By a strange fatality, the prisoner had died 8 days before the treaty was signed, of the same malady, at least if we may judge by analogy, that had carried off Bajazet's brother. As soon as the peace was signed, Prospero Colonna and Gonzalvo de Cordova, whom the Pope had demanded from Frederick, arrived at Rome with an army of Spanish and Neapolitan troops. Alexander, as he could not utilize these against the Orsini, set them the work of recapturing Ostia, not desiring to incur the reproach of bringing them to Rome for nothing. Gonzalvo was rewarded for this feat by receiving the Rose of Gold from the Pope's hand, that being the highest honor His Holiness can grant. He shared this distinction with the Emperor Maximilian, the King of France, the Doge of Venice, and the Marquis of Mantua. In the midst of all this occurred the solemn festival of the Assumption, in which Gonzalvo was invited to take part. He accordingly left his palace, proceeded in great pomp in the front of the pontifical cavalry, and took his place on the Duke of Gandia's left hand. The Duke attracted all eyes by his personal beauty, set off as it was by all the luxury he thought fit to display at this festival. He had a retinue of pages and servants clad in sumptuous liveries, incomparable for richness with anything heretofore seen in Rome, that city of religious pomp. All these pages and servants rode magnificent horses caparisoned in velvet, trimmed with silver fringe, and bells of silver hanging down every here and there. He himself was in a robe of gold brocade, and wore at his neck a string of Eastern pearls, perhaps the finest and largest that ever belonged to a Christian prince, while on his cap was a gold chain studded with diamonds, of which the smallest was worth more than 20,000 ducats. This magnificence was all the more conspicuous by the contrast it presented to Caesar's dress, whose scarlet robe admitted of no ornaments. The result was that Caesar, doubly jealous of his brother, felt a new hatred rise up within him when he heard all along the way the praises of his fine appearance and noble equipment. From this moment Cardinal Valentino decided in his own mind the fate of this man, this constant obstacle in the path of his pride, his love, and his ambition. Very good reason, says Tommaso the historian, had the Duke of Gandia to leave behind him an impression on the public mind of his beauty and his grandeur at this fete, for this last display was soon to be followed by the obsequies of the unhappy young man. Lucrezia also had come to Rome on the pretext of taking part in the solemnity, but really, as we shall see later, with the view of serving as a new instrument for her father's ambition. As the Pope was not satisfied with an empty triumph of vanity and display for his son, and as his war with the Orsini had failed to produce the anticipated results, he decided to increase the fortune of his firstborn by doing the very thing which he had accused Calixtus in his speech of doing for him, viz., alienating from the states of the Church the cities of Benevento, Terracino, and Pontecorvo to form a duchy as an appanage to his son's house. Accordingly, this proposition was put forward in a full consistory, and as the College of Cardinals was entirely Alexander's, there was no difficulty about carrying his point. This new favor to his elder brother exasperated Cæsar, although he was himself getting a share of the paternal gifts, for he had just been named envoy à la terre at Frederick's court, and was appointed to crown him with his own hands as the papal representative. But Lucrezia, when she had spent a few days of pleasure with her father and brothers, had gone into retreat at the convent of San Sisto. No one knew the real motive of her seclusion, and no entreaties of Cæsar, whose love for her was strange and unnatural, had induced her to defer this departure from the world even until the day after he left for Naples. His sister's obstinacy wounded him deeply, for ever since the day when the Duke of Gandia had appeared in the procession so magnificently attired, he fancied he had observed a coldness in the mistress of his illicit affection, and so far did this increase his hatred of his rival that he resolved to be rid of him at all costs. So he ordered the chief of his sbirri to come and see him the same night. Micheletto was accustomed to these mysterious messages, which almost always meant his help was wanted in some love affair or some act of revenge. As in either case his reward was generally a large one, he was careful to keep his engagement, and at the appointed hour was brought into the presence of his patron. Cæsar received him leaning against a tall chimney-piece, no longer wearing his cardinal's robe and hat, but a doublet of black velvet slashed with satin of the same color. One hand toyed mechanically with his gloves, while the other rested on the handle of a poisoned dagger which never left his side. This was the dress he kept for his nocturnal expeditions, so Micheletto felt no surprise at that. But his eyes burned with a flame more gloomy than their wont, and his cheeks, generally pale, were now livid. Micheletto had but to cast one look upon his master to see that Cæsar and he were about to share some terrible enterprise. He signed to him to shut the door. Micheletto obeyed. Then, after a moment's silence, during which the eyes of Borgia seemed to burn into the soul of the bravo, who with a careless air stood bareheaded before him, he said, in a voice whose slightly mocking tone gave the only sign of his emotion, "Micheletto, how do you think this dress suits me?" Accustomed as he was to his master's tricks of circumlocution, the bravo was so far from expecting this question that at first he stood mute, and only after a few moments' pause was able to say, "Admirably, Monsignore. Thanks to the dress, your Excellency has the appearance as well as the true spirit of a captain." "I am glad you think so," replied Cæsar. "And now let me ask you, do you know who is the cause that instead of wearing this dress, which I can only put on at night, I am forced to disguise myself in the daytime in a cardinal's robe and hat, and pass my time trotting about from church to church, from consistory to consistory, when I ought properly to be leading a magnificent army in the battlefield, where you would enjoy a captain's rank, instead of being the chief of a few miserable sbirri?" "Yes, Monsignore," replied Micheletto, who had divined Cæsar's meaning at his first word. "The man who is the cause of this is Francesco, Duke of Gandia and Benevento, your elder brother. Do you know," Cæsar resumed, giving no sign of assent, but a nod and a bitter smile, "do you know who has all the money and none of the genius? Who has the helmet and none of the brains? Who has the sword and no hand to wield it? That, too, is the Duke of Gandia," said Micheletto. "Do you know," continued Cæsar, "who is the man whom I find continually blocking the path of my ambition, my fortune, and my love?" "It is the same, the Duke of Gandia," said Micheletto. "And what do you think of it?" asked Cæsar. "I think he must die," replied the man coldly. "That is my opinion also, Micheletto," said Cæsar, stepping towards him and grasping his hand. and my only regret is that I did not think of it sooner, for if I had carried a sword at my side instead of a crosier in my hand when the King of France was marching through Italy, I should now have been the master of a fine domain. The Pope is obviously anxious to aggrandize his family, but he is mistaken in the means he adopts. It is I who ought to have been made duke, and my brother a cardinal. There is no doubt at all that had he made me duke, I should have contributed a daring and courage to his service that would have made his power far weightier than it is. The man who would make his way to vast dominions and a kingdom ought to trample under foot all the obstacles in his path, and boldly grasp the very sharpest thorns, whatever reluctance his weak flesh may feel. Such a man, if he would open out his path to fortune, should seize his dagger or his sword, and strike out with his eyes shut. He should not shrink from bathing his hands in the blood of his kindred. He should follow the example offered him by every founder of empire, from Romulus to Bajazet, both of whom climbed to the throne by the ladder of fratricide. Yes, Micheloto, as you say, such is my condition, and I am resolved I will not shrink. Now you know why I sent for you. Am I wrong in counting upon you?" As might have been expected, Micheloto, seeing his own fortune in this crime, replied that he was entirely at Cæsar's service, and that he had nothing to do but to give his orders as to time, place, and manner of execution. Cæsar replied that the time must needs be very soon, since he was on the point of leaving Rome for Naples. As to the place and the mode of execution, they would depend on circumstances, and each of them must look out for an opportunity and seize the first that seemed favorable. End of Section 14. Section 15. The Borgias, Chapter 7, Part 2. 2 days after this resolution had been taken, Cæsar learned that the day of his departure was fixed for Thursday, the 15th of June. At the same time he received an invitation from his mother to come to supper with her on the 14th. This was a farewell repast given in his honor. Micheloto received orders to be in readiness at 11 o'clock at night. The table was set in the open air in a magnificent vineyard, a property of Rosa Venozza's in the neighborhood of San Piero in Vinculus. The guests were Cæsar Borgia, the hero of the occasion, the Duke of Gandia, the Prince of Squillace, Donna Sancha, his wife, the Cardinal of Montereale, Francesco Borgia, son of Calixtus III, Don Rodrigo Borgia, captain of the Apostolic Palace, Don Goffredo, brother of the Cardinal, Gian Borgia, at that time the ambassador at Perugia, and lastly Don Alfonso Borgia, the Pope's nephew. The whole family, therefore, was present except Lucrezia, who was still in retreat and would not come. The repast was magnificent. Cæsar was quite as cheerful as usual, and the Duke of Gandia seemed more joyous than he had ever been before. In the middle of supper a man in a mask brought him a letter. The Duke unfastened it, coloring up with pleasure, and when he had read it, answered in these words, "I will come." Then he quickly hid the letter in the pocket of his doublet, but quick as he was to conceal it from every eye, Cæsar had had time to cast a glance that way, and he fancied he recognized the handwriting of his sister Lucrezia. Meanwhile the messenger had gone off with his answer, no one but Cæsar paying the slightest attention to him, for at that period it was the custom for messages to be conveyed by men in domino, or by women whose faces were concealed by a veil. At 10 o'clock they rose from the table, and, as the air was sweet and mild, they walked about a while under the magnificent pine trees that shaded the house of Rosa Venozza, while Cæsar never for an instant let his brother out of his sight. At 11 o'clock the Duke of Gandia bade good night to his mother. Cæsar at once followed suit, alleging his desire to go to the Vatican to bid farewell to the Pope, as he would not be able to fulfill this duty on the morrow, his departure being fixed at daybreak. This pretext was all the more plausible, since the Pope was in the habit of sitting up every night till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The two brothers went out together, mounted their horses, which were waiting for them at the door, and rode side by side as far as the Palazzo Borgia, the present home of Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, who had taken it as a gift from Alexander the night before his election to the papacy. There the Duke of Gandia separated from his brother, saying with a smile that he was not intending to go home, as he had several hours to spend first with a fair lady who was expecting him. Cæsar replied that he was no doubt free to make any use he liked best of his opportunities, and wished him a very good night. The Duke turned to the right and Cæsar to the left, but Cæsar observed that the street the Duke had taken led in the direction of the convent of San Sisto, where, as we said, Lucrezia was in retreat. His suspicions were confirmed by this observation, and he directed his horse's steps to the Vatican, found the Pope, took his leave of him, and received his benediction. From this moment all is wrapped in mystery and darkness, like that in which the terrible deed was done that we are now to relate. This, however, is what is believed. The Duke of Gandia, when he quitted Cæsar, sent away his servants, and in the company of one confidential valet alone, pursued his course towards the Piazza della Giudecca. There he found the same man in a mask who had come to speak to him at supper, and, forbidding his valet to follow any farther, he bade him wait on the piazza where they then stood, promising to be on his way back in 2 hours' time at latest, and to take him up as he passed. And at the appointed hour the Duke reappeared, took leave this time of the man in the mask, and retraced his steps towards his palace. But scarcely had he turned the corner of the Jewish ghetto, when 4 men on foot, led by a 5th who was on horseback, flung themselves upon him. Thinking they were thieves, or else that he was the victim of some mistake, the Duke of Gandia mentioned his name, but instead of the name checking the murderer's daggers, their strokes were redoubled, and the Duke very soon fell dead, his valet dying beside him. Then the man on horseback, who had watched the assassination with no sign of emotion, backed his horse towards the dead body. The 4 murderers lifted the corpse across the crupper, and walking side by side to support it, then made their way down the lane that leads to the church of Santa Maria in Monticelli. The wretched valet they left for dead upon the pavement, but he, after a lapse of a few seconds, regained some small strength, and his groans were heard by the inhabitants of a poor little house hard by. They came and picked him up and laid him upon a bed, where he died almost at once, unable to give any evidence as to the assassin or any details of the murder. All night the Duke was expected home, and all the next morning. Then expectation was turned into fear, and fear at last into deadly terror. The Pope was approached and told that the Duke of Gandia had never come back to his palace since he left his mother's house. But Alexander tried to deceive himself all through the rest of the day, hoping that his son might have been surprised by the coming of daylight in the midst of an amorous adventure, and was waiting till the next night to get away in that darkness which had aided his coming thither. But the night, like the day, passed and brought no news. On the morrow the Pope, tormented by the gloomiest presentiments and by the raven's croak of the vox populi, let himself fall into the depths of despair. Amid sighs and sobs of grief, all he could say to anyone who came to him was but these words, repeated 1,000 times: "Search, search, let us know how my unhappy son has died." Then everybody joined in the search, for, as we have said, the Duke of Gandia was beloved by all, but nothing could be discovered from scouring the town except the body of the murdered man, who was recognized as the Duke's valet. Of his master there was no trace whatever. It was then thought, not without reason, that he had probably been thrown into the Tiber, and they began to follow along its banks, beginning from the Via della Ripetta, questioning every boatman and fisherman who might possibly have seen, either from their houses or from their boats, what had happened on the river banks during the 2 preceding nights. At first all inquiries were in vain, but when they had gone up as high as the Via del Fantanone, they found a man at last who said he had seen something happen on the night of the 14th, which might very possibly have some bearing on the subject of the inquiry. He was a Slav named George, who was taking up the river a boat laden with wood to Ripetta. The following are his own words. "Gentlemen," he said, "last Wednesday evening, when I had set down my load of wood on the bank, I remained in my boat, resting in the cool night air, and watching lest other men should come and take away what I had just unloaded, when, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I saw coming out of the lane on the left of San Girolamo's church 2 men on foot, who came forward in the middle of the street, and looked so carefully all around that they seemed to have come to find out if anybody was going along the street. When they felt sure that it was deserted, they went back along the same lane, whence issued presently 2 other men, who used similar precautions to make sure that there was nothing fresh. They, when they found all as they wished, gave a sign to their companions to come and join them. Next appeared one man on a dapple-gray horse, which was carrying on the crupper the body of a dead man, his head and arms hanging over on one side and his feet on the other. The 2 fellows I had first seen exploring were holding him up by the arms and legs. The other 3 at once went up to the river, while the first 2 kept a watch on the street, and advancing to the part of the bank where the sewers of the town are discharged into the Tiber, the horseman turned his horse, backing on the river. Then the 2 who were at either side, taking the corpse, one by the hands, the other by the feet, swung it 3 times, and the 3rd time threw it out into the river with all their strength. Then, at the noise made when the body splashed into the river, the horseman asked, "Is it done?" And the others answered, "Yes, sir," and he at once turned right about face. But seeing the dead man's cloak floating, he asked what was that black thing swimming about. "Sir," said one of the men, "it is his cloak." And then another man picked up some stones, and running to the place where it was still floating, threw them so as to make it sink under. As soon as it had quite disappeared, they went off, and after walking a little way along the main road, they went into the lane that leads to San Giacomo. That was all I saw, gentlemen, and so it is all I can answer to the questions you have asked me." At these words, which robbed of all hope any who might yet entertain it, one of the Pope's servants asked the Slav why, when he was witness of such a deed, he had not gone to denounce it to the governor. But the Slav replied that, since he had exercised his present trade on the riverside, he had seen dead men thrown into the Tiber in the same way 100 times, and had never heard that anybody had been troubled about them. So he supposed it would be the same with this corpse as the others, and had never imagined